Okay, so this is going to be an intro to Rhino. Rhino is a great software for creating complex geometry. Again, it uses calculus for its creation of its NURBS geometry. NURBS is a type of kind of spline-based surface, and we're going to introduce the basics of it and kind of the way that the modeling workflow is best suited for Rhino. So a lot of architects use this, furniture designers, industrial designers, jewelry designers, all kinds of different professions use Rhino for modeling. So it's a command-based software, so you can type commands. So if you just type line, enter, you'll have the ability to click twice and draw a line. So you can type commands into the command line. You don't need to click on the command line, you just type it and hit enter and it'll run. The other way that you can access the commands is through these tabs. So each tab has a set of tools or a set of commands, and you can access curves, surfaces, solid tools, sub D, which is another type of geometry for more curvilinear geometry, meshes, which are a triangulated geometry, render tools, drafting. So there's a lot you can do within Rhino. So a lot of people do actual drawing sets in Rhino. It's originally derived from early versions of AutoCAD. So it kind of emerged at that time. So a lot of the tools and a lot of the commands that are true for AutoCAD also apply for Rhino as well. So that's something to keep in mind for those who were transitioning from AutoCAD. A lot of the commands are the same. So you'll notice when you start off, there's 4 viewports here. You can double click on any one of them to have it full screen. Holding the right mouse button will toggle the view. Then, double clicking back on this, you can go into top view. The right mouse button is now the pan. The scroll button is zoom. And that's true for all of these viewports. And what's great, about this and other modeling software, when you create something, let's say I type box, I create something in one view, it's going to show me that same geometry in the other views, and I can right click on perspective and set this to shaded if I want to, and I can do that in all of these. There's different views. I can go into rendered view, I can go into technical where it'll show line work, Arctic where it'll show kind of a ambient occlusion rendered view, but I can set different view styles for each of these. And as I change something in one view, it's going to change it in the others. So if I'm modeling something that I want to see in elevation, this is a good workflow to use. Double clicking back on this, we'll go through the toolbars and how you access commands. Again, what I recommend doing is going through these toolbars and exploring them, see what's possible, see what's available. This is the sidebar on the left. And then on the right, there's other tabs. I like to have layers on the top and then properties down below. And if for some reason these are ever closed or they're not here, if you go to the standard toolbar, you'll see properties here. You can dock this at the bottom, and you'll see layers here. You can dock this above them there. This is views, so you can set specific views. So if you're doing renderings or you're outputting the same image, you can save that view so that after you toggle and move around, you can always get back to it by saving a view. So I like to have that next to layers here. And in addition to these tabs, there's also other toolbars. So if I right click just on this open space here, you'll see that there's the show toolbar option, and I can scroll down and check any specific toolbar that I like. So all of these have an entire kind of suite of tools. I can take this and I can dock it at the top here if I want this to be in the tabs. So for example, if I'm doing a lot of solid modeling like spheres, cubes, cones, and I want to have this here, I can dock it there. I can have it free floating. If I want it to be kind of stationary, if I want this to be persistent and still be able to toggle through everything else, I can dock it there as well. So I can grab it by the kind of blue toolbar and move it around, or I can grab it by the tab and then it'll just add to the list of tabs up here. So that's the different ways that we can add to the toolbar set here. I have a couple things here. This is V-Ray, so this is a plugin for Rhino that allows us to do rendering. So we can render images, simulate materials, create lighting scenarios for the model. Rhino has rendering capabilities built into it, but they're a little bit more basic. V-Ray has more advanced rendering tools. I also like to have the C-plane tab up here. I like to have that docked in case I need to change the orientation of my C-plane. So Rhino is a coordinates-based software, so it uses the X, Y, and Z coordinates. So you can see this triad down in the bottom. That's going to rotate with my geometry. So it'll tell me which direction is X, Y, and Z is up here. And then if you type options, enter, you'll see a series of properties and options. Here you can set the units, so I can go to units and set this to feet or inches, and this is the default units. But just because you're in feet doesn't mean you can't, say, draw a line and type 30 millimeters. You can still specify other units when you're working, but it's going to default to one of these when you're in Rhino, and when you're in Grasshopper, it's going to look at your model units as well. Okay, so if you want to change your units, you can do that here. Under grid, this is showing us this kind of grid point, you know, the grid that's here. I can set the number of grid lines that I want. So it's set to 200. If I want that to be 100, it reduced it. Again, I can type options, enter, and I can set the spacing for each of these, and these are a reference grid. I can also snap to these grid lines, so when I'm working, if I want to snap to a grid, I can do that by setting the grid here, and I can set grid snapping to various increments. Other settings here, you can kind of add your own aliases, so you can make your own keyboard shortcuts here. So again, this is under options. If you go to aliases, you can go to new, and you can set which keyboard shortcut you want to use, and then you'll have to pull up the actual command that Rhino sees. So you're just going to associate a command like, let's say line, I want that to be L. And you have to copy the actual kind of the symbols that they use here before you add the text. So for example, if I say new, I want L to be line. So I have to do this underscore line. And so now when I hit OK and I type L, it's going to default to line. I think before, when you type L, it would default to lasso or something else. So I like to have L go to line. And you can do that for other keyboard shortcuts too. So going back to options, just some other things, files, this is going to autosave. So it's going to autosave every 20 minutes, and it's going to save it in this location. So I recommend keeping this on, or if you're working on a lot of things, and maybe autosave more frequently, just so if your computer crashes or something happens, it's going to recover your files. Oftentimes models can get really heavy and Rhino will crash, so it's important to constantly be saving and keep track of your file structure. All right, toolbars, view. So other things here that we can kind of learn from. If you go to help and you go to learn Rhino, you'll see tutorials on the web. If you click on that, it'll take you to the Rhino tutorial page, and they have some really great videos here that aren't on YouTube. I think these are on Vimeo. So
you can maximize a viewport to
this will be a really good example to get you up and running with Rhino even further. So this one goes over different geometry types, so object types, so points, curves, surfaces, solids, sub-D, and meshes. So there's some great tutorials on this. Okay, so I'll go over briefly the workflow in Rhino, how to create geometry and work with it. And different designers have different workflows that they use. This is one that I think most designers will prefer. So the way we start in Rhino typically begins with curves. So we start with curves, and curves include lines. A line is essentially a curve with no curvature. So a line is technically under the category of a curve. So if we start with a polyline, we can start with that, and I hit enter, and you notice the way I do that, I typed polyline, right? I could also find the polyline tab here and use that to create this. And just kind of following the text prompt, if you read what's happening down here, it'll give you an understanding of what it's expecting you to do next. So I hit enter when I'm done. I have two polylines. And again, the workflow that I think most designers will use is they'll start with curves, then use those curves to create surfaces, and then use those surfaces to create solids. So if I have a curve here, I can then turn this into a surface in a few ways. I can take this, I can type extrude curve, and now it's going to extrude the curve into a surface. Yes. Okay, so we can extrude. There's other ways that we can create surfaces. Now that I have this poly surface here, again, clicking on this, this is a poly surface. I can type explode, and now it's creating multiple surfaces here. And you'll notice when I click on an object, it has this gumball. So this is a triad that I can manipulate. So I can manipulate this by pushing and pulling various axes, right? I can move it this way. And that gumball is accessed down here under Gumball. So normally by default when you open up Rhino, it doesn't appear, so you have to go down and click Gumball for that to be active. And once it is, you can move things. Like I said, you can rotate them with that. And it's going to rotate about the center of the geometry. You can also scale. So if I wanted to scale this geometry, the squares will help me scale the geometry. Okay, so that's kind of the intro to Gumball. You can also move this. You can change the location of where you want the Gumball to be, you can reset it and kind of snap it in different places. Down here, these are the various snaps. So this might be another thing that is unchecked when you first open up Rhino. I have end, near, point, mid. These are all snaps. So for example, if I have a line, type line, and I want to draw another line. If I mouse over this, notice how it says near right next to my cursor. That's because it's finding the nearest intersection. It's trying to determine where my point is. That's because near is checked here. And then notice the end, right? It says end. So that's because end is checked. So if I were to uncheck those two things and type line, it's no longer going to find the nearest point or the end point. But checking those, now it's going to find them. Okay, it's also going to find the midpoint because I have mid checked down here. So just be aware those snaps will make your life really easy when you're modeling. So if you want to snap to the endpoint, I recommend having that selected. And when you just draw lines or curves in Rhino, and I can show you a NURBS curve. This is a control curve. With this, when you draw this, it's flat. It's two-dimensional here. So with that, it's drawing it directly on the C-plane. So this is the C-plane, and this can be moved. This can be manipulated. That's why I like to have the C-plane tab up here, because if I ever want to kind of model something or draw something in space, I can change the orientation of that C-plane. So I can say set C-plane to world front. And now if I just draw a polyline in freeform space, it's going to draw it along the C-plane that I just created, right? So it's now going to draw it based on that. And so just in general, when I go to draw, it's going to align it with the C-plane. And then I can set the C-plane back to world top, back to where it was. The other way to draw something in elevation like I was is to go to the other views. And I just double clicked on perspective. I can go into right view and I can draw, for example, a rectangle, right? If I want that rectangle to be sitting up vertically, I can then go back into perspective and see that I just drew that along that C-plane. So the right view, left view, top, back, front, those all have a C-plane associated with that particular view. So I can go to, you'll see this car up here. If I ever want to change the particular view that I'm in, I can change the orientation of that front view, left view, side view. I can change it here if it's not in one of these options. You can also look at the C-plane in different ways. Like if I wanted to see the top of the C-plane, I can change this, and it's kind of funny. The icon for that is an actual C-plane. So you can go to view, top view of the C-plane, and now it's the top view of my C-plane. All right, so that's C-plane. If you ever, you're modeling and let's say you get zoomed out and you're far away from your geometry and you want to kind of zoom back in, you can select it and click on this zoom selected, and it'll zoom in on the object you just selected, and it'll orbit, or when you orbit, it'll orbit around that geometry. So, if you're working on something over here and you want it to orbit around that, select it and hit this, and now you're going to orbit around that geometry. So that's a good tip to keep in mind. That's under the standard toolbar, and this is called zoom selected. Okay, so we're talking about the workflow in Rhino of starting with curves, creating a surface out of them. The other way we can create surfaces, and let's draw a couple NURBS curves here. So I can take this, if I wanted to duplicate it, I can select it, and with Gumball turned on, I can hold down the Alt button on my keyboard, pull this up, and now I have two curves. With those curves, I can then rotate this, I can manipulate it any way I want. You'll also notice when I have a curve or any line, I select it and these control points turn on. I can select a control point and manipulate that as well, and that's gonna manipulate the geometry. So if I'm creating an art installation of some kind and I want to create this curving wall, and it's curving in many directions here, it's double curved, what I can do is manipulate the curve. Now I have two, and if I wanted to create a surface between these two curves, I could simply use the loft command. So I could type loft, click on the curves that I want to loft between, hit enter, and I now have a surface between those two curves. Okay, so that's the loft command. And that and other surface tools are here under Surface Tools tab. When you click on that, it'll update the sidebar here as well. So these are some more surface techniques. Many different ways of creating a rectangle. Here, surface from 3 or 4 points. So if you want to create a surface that way. And then if you select an object, you can also type points on, enter, and you can select multiple points, manipulate them, and adjust these to create the curvature or manipulate the geometry the way you want. Okay, so that's points on. That's another useful command in Rhino. Okay, so we've created a few surfaces. We've used the loft tool. There's also extrude. Ribbon is another command. Sweep. So let's say instead of just a kind of a surface that's created from these two curves, we can also create a sweep. So let's say I want another curve between these two, and I want to manipulate this a little bit so that it maybe bulges out. So what this command sweep will do is it's going to take a profile and it's going to sweep it along a rail. So I can take this profile and it's going to follow the path, kind of like follow me in SketchUp. But if I hit sweep one rail, select the rail, and then select the sweep shape, enter, hit OK, and now it's going to sweep a curvilinear surface, and it's again using this as the profile to create this geometry. So instead of it just being a kind of a straight line in section, it's now a curve in section. So we're now manipulating the surface a little bit here. All right, so that's one way to do a sweep. There's another way to do a sweep, which is sweep two rails. So here, if you select this, you select the first rail, select the second rail, and select the sweep shape, which in this case is this, enter, and hit OK. And it's going to sweep along both rails simultaneously. So if I know this is my upper edge and this is my lower edge, and I want it to constrain to both of those, and I still want this to be my profile kind of in section, this is the command to use for that, sweep two rails. Okay, so you can see how this could be useful for, complex architecture, or if you're creating a, some ergonomic industrial design or furniture. Rhino is really the ideal software for that. And there's also, so once we've done that, we've created surfaces, we can merge those surfaces together to create poly surfaces or to create solids. Okay, so let's say I've taken this. Let's say I want to create a curve that approximates between this curve and this curve, kind of like an in-between curve. So there's actually a command called tween curves. So if you select the start curve and the end curve, it's going to give you a curve that approximates somewhere between those two. So then I can do the same thing. I could either sweep or I could loft. I'm going to move this a little bit. And I'm going to create another NURBS curve here. I'm just going to type curve. And you can set the degree. So this is another thing, when you type in a command into Rhino, it's going to give you some options here in this command line. You can change these by clicking on them. So this is curve degree 3. I can change this to 2 or 4. I can change that number here. And you'll notice changing that will affect the curvature type. So with 2, it's going to be a little bit sharper. Actually, sorry, it's going to be a little more loose as far as the control. But if I were to type curve degree 4, yeah, actually that's going to be a little more controlled for that. Anyway, selecting this again, let's say I wanted to add a control point to this. I can select the curve and type insert control point, and then I can click on that curve, enter, select that control point. Oh, that's right. So with a degree of 2, that's a polyline. So it's going to create a polyline instead of a NURBS curve when I do that. Whereas for these, if I type insert control point, click on this, do the same thing here, it's going to have different effects based on the degree of those curves that I created. Slightly different types of curvature. Okay, so I have a polyline here. Let's use that. So I'm going to use that as my sweep 2. And again, this time I'm just typing it in, sweep 2. First rail, second rail, and always read down here what it's looking for. And then it says select sweep shape. So in this case, I'm going to sweep this edge shape, enter, and now I have this. And let's say to close this off, I want to just create a line. Actually, I'll just do a sweep, or a loft. I'll just type loft, select these 2 curves, and I have this geometry. Okay, so if I select all of these surfaces, I can hold shift to select many things at the same time, and I can type join, enter. Right, I'm going to move this out here, and again, when I move it, I could just move it like that and it's going to drag it, or I could select it, hold down Alt, and then it'll duplicate it. So if I want to have another instance of this object, that's a workflow I recommend. And you can select this geometry. If we type cap, it's actually not going to work because we have it's kind of a non-planar end condition here. So we can't cap it that way. But there is a command called patch. So we can use the patch tool, and with this I can select multiple curves, and it's going to do its best to approximate a surface that'll close the end of that. So it's a little bit uncontrollable. It's kind of difficult to predict how it's going to close that geometry, but it'll do its best to calculate that. So I can type patch again, select all of these open edges. Yeah, you can see how unpredictable that command is. I'll show you another command actually that'll help resolve this end. If I wanted to slice off this whole end condition here, there's a few ways to do that. I'm going to use the plane tool. I'm going to click on rectangular plane, and then scrolling down to what it's looking for, it's asking for the first corner of the plane, and it's asking for, these are options that I can give it. So I want this rectangular plane to be vertical. So I click vertical, and what I want to do is kind of create a slicing surface so that I can trim that geometry. So I've just created a plane. I can select this, move it down with the gumball, and I can select this and type trim. So this is another command straight out of AutoCAD. You can trim that surface. So now I've trimmed it, and if I select this and type cap, enter, it is able to calculate a cap for that because this is all planar. It's easier for it to create that geometry. So I've just capped this geometry. Let's do the same thing for the other end here. So type plane, click vertical, click, and that's going to constrain it to being vertical. Move this down to make sure you're slicing through the entire geometry, or else it won't calculate it. And I'm going to select that and type trim. And then I'm going to select the thing that I want to trim. I can delete this, and then select this again and type cap, and it's going to close up any open ends of that geometry. All right, so I've now capped this thing. It's one closed poly surface, so it's one solid object now. So now that it's solid, I can do things in the solid tools toolbar that I couldn't do before. So for example, if I wanted to intersect this with something else, this is a truncated cone. I can select that, make a truncated cone here. And let's say I want to subtract this geometry from this geometry. So basically take a bite out of this original geometry that I made. Now that these are both solid geometries, I can do that easily. So I can select this first one that we did. This is the Boolean difference. So I can Boolean subtract this from this. So I can select it, Boolean subtract. Look down here, it says select the surfaces to subtract with. Click that, enter, and now it just used that truncated cone to subtract from my original geometry. Okay, so that's another way to, work with solids. So if I have, for example, a box, and if I wanted to repeat a command, you can always hit spacebar or hit enter and it'll repeat it. Right, so if I have these two boxes and I manipulate them, right now these are two independent things. If I want this to be one merged geometry that's completely enclosed, I can select both of these and go to this Boolean union. It's going to add those two geometries together. And so now this is one thing, one poly surface. Okay. Another really good tool, just while we're talking about kind of solids and slicing, is the clipping plane. So if I type clipping plane and I set this to vertical, this allows me to cut a section through my model. And you'll notice for solids, it's going to give you a preview that is solid. So these are my solid geometries. I can select this clipping plane and move it, but it's going to basically take a section. It's going to make a cut through any geometry you have that kind of intersects with it. Okay, so here's the clipping plane. This could be great for creating drawings. if you have a section drawing that you're working on, this is a really good way to kind of probe inside your model and inspect it, as well as representation. And so you'll notice for solid geometries it closes the object because it's a closed solid. But then for surfaces it keeps it open because remember we never closed this geometry, right? So cutting a clipping plane through it means that it's going to represent it as still being open. Okay, so with this, and again, there's tons of other commands that we can explore here, like the shell command. You can shell a closed poly surface. So I select that, select this closed poly surface, hit enter, and it's going to create a little shell around the entire surface so that it's three-dimensional, or so that it has a thickness to it. One other really great kind of technique for those of us in architecture, we can take the geometry that we just worked on and we can create line work out of it relatively easily. So by default we're in perspective. You can change that here under the properties tab. If you want, you can change this to parallel. So now it's in isometric view. If you wanted to set a particular isometric, you can just type isometric and you can set the view you want. Northeast, spacebar, northwest. And so what it's going to do is it's going to align your view so that this is one of the traditional isometric views. So this can be a really great representation tool, or if you're creating an isometric drawing, this can be a great way to do that. Okay, so this can help you set your view. And so we're now in parallel. I can zoom in on this. Let's say I want to create a drawing from this model. I can select the geometry, and one of the ways we do this, we can type make 2D. So this is a way of creating line work out of your 3D model. So this is great for doing diagrams, creating detailed drawings. This line work can then be exported into AutoCAD, into Illustrator, whatever your software is, you can export from this. So I'm going to turn off tangent edges. I think that's on by default. Hidden lines, we can turn those off. And this is going to give you a preview of what it's going to do. It's going to give you a scene silhouette, which will be kind of its own line that you can use to create kind of a heavy profile. And then it's going to group the output. So you can check these preferences before you hit OK. But what it does is it takes whatever view you were just in, and then it creates a line drawing from that geometry you had selected. And then it projects that drawing flat on the C-plane. So if I move this over, so this is a drawing of the model that I just had. So double click, I can go into top view, and again I had set this to Arctic view. I can set this to shaded and find that drawing that I just created. And I can select these and then export. And actually before we do that, you can go and you'll notice under the layers tab, you'll see this new tab for make 2D. There's a series of layers that it just generated. So for all of the lines in this drawing that it just generated, we have different layers. Like the scene silhouette, I can set that to be its own color. And then if I were to hide some of these, display color is set to black. I can set this to by layer, and now it's going to show up in the color that I expect it to here by changing that layer. And then, so each of these lines are kind of independent. So like if my clipping plane intersections, if I want those to be their own color, I can set that here. I can select objects, set these to by layer. So now anytime that I have a clipping plane intersection, those show up as red. And this will come into play when I import this into Illustrator and I want to isolate each of these layers and have different line weights associated with it, each line color. I can do that a little more easily. So I can select this line work, and again, I'm in top view, type export, enter. I can export this as a Illustrator file. So call this test, go to Adobe Illustrator, and saving that, I can now open this as line work, and this will be vector line work that I can open in Illustrator. I can go to open, find that file that I just created, and now I have the line work. So I can select this, scale it up a little bit, and you'll notice our layers are also showing up here. So I can hide one of these if I want. I don't want that edge. I can delete it. So for example, if I want to select everything that's on this layer, I can select the circle off to the right. And now I have this selected. I can change the stroke width here. So this is the line weight. I can bump that up if I want to maybe 5. So that's 5 point. I can set this to black because that's what we want for this diagram. And then the other thing that's going to get a heavy line weight is what's being cut here. So I can select that layer by selecting the circle next to it as well. I can set this to black. Set that to black, and then change this line weight. We can bump this up to 7. Maybe I'll set this down to 2 to have a little bit more contrast, maybe 3. And then the rest of the curves, we can bring this down to maybe 0.5. So there's a little bit of hierarchy in this drawing. Okay, so this is an effective way to create diagrams straight out of Rhino, bring them into Illustrator. And then you can take this even further. You can select these, you can fill in various sides of this. So I can select this, go to Object, Live Paint, Make, and it's going to put all of that on the same layer, but the payoff is that you're able to use the Paint Bucket tool. So with the Paint Bucket tool, you can use these fills and you can kind of fill in with color. So if I wanted to create kind of a lighter surface, I could do that. Darker surface. All right, so this is a great kind of diagramming technique. If you want to create more cartoon-like diagrams, this is one of the workflows that I like to use in Rhino and then going into Illustrator. Okay, and then you can individually, change line weights for individual lines if you want to, play with that. And once you're happy with the drawing, let's say I delete this. There's ways of using arrows effectively in Illustrator as well. I like to add callouts and text to various diagrams that we produce. So for example, I can create a line. First, I'll create a new layer. So down here, there's the Create New Layer tab. I'm going to click on Line, draw a line, and you can set the end of that line to have an arrow. So if you go to Stroke, Arrowhead, there's different types of arrows. I like this arrow 10 as a style. We can change the line weight to build this up a little bit. And with this, I can add annotations to my drawing. So another way, another line type here, arrow type, we can go to maybe arrow 7. This is another simple one. We can change the size of that arrow by setting the scale here. So this is set to 100. Let's set this down to 70. Enter. All right, so we can call out various items, various properties and materials on our diagram this way. And then simply by going to text, we can start saying, you know, green, using all caps for most architectural text, green roof, for example. You can change the scale. Okay, and then for our office, when we kind of work with this stuff, we like to group these. So select, hold shift, select, and then right click and say group. So we can group these together. And then by double clicking, you can edit them individually, but double click to get out. All right, so this is how to annotate a drawing that we created and imported from Rhino. All right, once you're happy with this, you can go to File, you can do a save a copy. So first, before you do anything, let's first save. We'll call this diagram test. So that saves it as an Illustrator file, which you want to do. If you want to generate a PDF out of this, you would go to File, Save a Copy, and you could change this type to PDF. So call this diagram test, save PDF, and now it'll generate a PDF out of this. You can also export images. So I can go to File, Export, Export As, and I can save this as a JPEG. If I check this Use Artboards, it's going to make the extents of my image this white artboard. If I don't check this, it's going to make the extents of my image just kind of right up to the boundary of my artwork. So I'm going to check that, say diagram test. Set this to RGB if you want to view it on a screen. Set it to CMYK if you're going to see it printed. All right, and then once I've found that, I can go to my file and you'll see the image that we just created. And I set that to high res. It's maybe 300 DPI. So really high resolution, really great workflow for creating diagrams.